potential Alaskan sourdough miners would typically bring just whatever it was they could carry and nothing more. That kit would consist of a simple backpack, maybe a bedroll and a tent, a pickaxe and a shovel, a saw, a gold pan, probably a rifle of some kind, and a mule if they were lucky, working their way through this densely forested wilderness, searching for creeks that had at least the suggestion of gold in the banks of those creeks. Now, if the sourdough had his act together, he'd construct what was called a rocker box, which was essentially a portable little sluice box set up on the creek bank near his campsite. Now, we've got our own prospector coming up here on the right to demonstrate to you live what that would have looked like, or at least give you a sense of it. Now, occasionally these sourdough miners would get lucky, hit the jackpot, strike it rich. Usually, however, they would lose their shirts broke, and hence emerged the reference of the Alaskan sourdough miner as being sour would only dig in the winter time. That's for safety purposes. Again, we're talking about dealing with frozen permafrost here. If it's allowed to warm up and thaw out, it essentially just turns into a bunch of mud, and you got a great risk of cave-ins that way. When the summer times would come, they'd seal these shafts off to keep it nice and cool down there. They'd proceed to wash through all the material that they'd excavated throughout the winter. At the bottoms of these shafts, they'd have a loaded ore car, or wheelbarrow, lowering one of these iron muck buckets down the shaft. They'd unload the ore cars into these buckets, then hoist the buckets back up, run them along these cables here, like you see, all the way up to that pole called the gem pole, where eventually the buckets would catch. See the bottom two cables, little burrs on them there? It's going to make the bucket stop right about there and then swivel fully, extending and then dump its load. And let them come coasting back down empty to bang into these logs here and be reset for the next load. Just about something anyway. You get the picture like that, but all winter long. And therefore those piles would get really big. So they would erect new gin poles and start new piles as they needed to for more room. By the end of the winters, there were piles of gold ore everywhere. And as that warm summer weather arrived, they would thaw each one of these piles back out again so they could wash all the gold from them. Now, long before they were ready to wash any gold from these piles of gravel, though, you have to step back and consider the amount of work it required to get that material out of the ground in the first place. Now again, in the early days, before they had access to hardware like this to make that work easier for them, in the early days, all they had with them was what they could carry on their back. Their hand tools would typically consist of a pickaxe and a shovel. That's about it. This ground was frozen solid. You couldn't just dig down into it. They figured out they needed to build a big fire, a bonfire, about the size of the diameter shaft they wanted to dig, usually about 6 feet in diameter. As that fire would burn, it would serve to thaw out just the first few inches of the topmost layer of that overburden, the permafrost. Then, when the fire would burn out, they would excavate with their pickaxes and shovels where that fire had been until they would chink back down into some more frozen ground and couldn't dig any further. They would then build another fire and repeat that process over and over again, just a few inches at a time, until they got all the way down to bedrock, which around here was anywhere from 20 feet down upwards to 200 feet. Now, in the early days, in order to get that material out of the ground, they started off with the use of what was called a windlass, which would consist of a large log stretched over the top of the shaft with handles on each end of that log so they could crank it around and spin it. They would then secure a rope to the center of that log and suspend that rope down the shaft, the end of which would be connected onto a big bucket. The crew down below would then fill that bucket full of material. The crew up top would then crank that log round and round. As they spin that log around, it would pull the rope around that log. And they were called the windlass because by the time that crew got done cranking that heavy bucket to the top of the shaft, they were out of wind. It was an incredible amount of work. And they evolved from the use of the windlass to the introduction of draft animals, donkeys, mules, horses, that sort of thing. They'd have that same log secured over the top of the shaft, but instead with a pulley system, allowing the animals to pull the load up out of the hole that way. Then, later on was it, when they knew that they were on a bona fide claim that they were working, producing gold, that's when they would go to the trouble, effort, and expense of hauling in a furnace to set up nearby, typically a wood or coal-burning furnace, that was used to produce steam. Steam lines would then be issued from that furnace, initially because they could localize that heat very precisely. They'd send that steam line down to the tunnels to help thaw them out throughout the winter. They would then send the steam to those piles to help thaw them out again throughout the summertime. And all the while they used the steam to power their steam engines, like the one Kay's been operating over here for us. Those were called the steam donkeys. So up until about 1920, that's what these outfits typically look like. And notwithstanding their efforts of safety in the summers when they steal these shafts off, a lot of times they slough off and cave in anyway. Or, more typically, because the tunnels were below the water table, they'd often fill up with water and then freeze solid. They'd have to start all over again. It wasn't very efficient. Now meanwhile, gold was only 19 bucks an ounce. So these guys were only going after the big stuff, the large nuggets and the larger flakes. They didn't have the incentives, the efficiencies, the economies of scale to go after the tiny stuff they left behind called the waste gold. So by about 1920, they figured all the gold here had played out. If there wasn't any gold left here, or if there was, it wasn't worth their efforts to go get it. Well, the big boys knew differently. And here I'm referring to the Fairbanks Exploration Company, the FE company. They came into town with what was called their Keystone Drill Rig, pile drivers.